Alright, so here we go again with me being insanely lucky and having awesome, very trusting friends. So now I'm on my friend's 2016 Yamaha R1 in the absolutely gorgeous 60th anniversary paint scheme. I haven't ridden one of these before, other than maybe just up and down the neighborhood street. So there are already 1,000 reviews of this bike online. It's like the it bike of the last year or two. So this isn't going to be your standard review where I regurgitate specs and facts about different features and electronic controls and stuff. Because honestly, if you want that, you've probably already seen a million of those videos. Or you've read all the really good reviews from the actual journalists that know what they're talking about. So instead, this video is just going to be more first impressions, kind of give you a feeling of what the bike is like if you've never had a chance to be on one. So my first thought after first climbing on is the cockpit feels really similar after riding my Rs before all the time. It feels immediately at home. That's pretty much where the similarities end, though, other than maybe the engine note is somewhat similar with the cross-plane R1. The power band's very different. The way the bike turns in is somewhat similar, but feels heavier than the RS4. This thing takes a little bit more effort to turn in, but it still seems fast to flick. You can't really call that a negative or a positive, it's just setup. I'm sure you could adjust the suspension and geometry to make the bike feel any way you want. The wheelie control does a really good job. Not that I'm a fan of wheelie control in general, just because I'm a hooligan and I like to do wheelies. But it does a great job of letting the front tire float, you know, a few inches off the ground without abruptly slamming it back down like the Aprilia tends to do sometimes. In fact, the Aprilia tends to do that even when the wheelie control is off, I think just because the traction control gets confused. The front wheel's up, the front tire slows down, the rear tire is still going fast, and it incorrectly figures that that's wheel spin. The R1 doesn't seem to suffer from that issue, which I would expect. This is multiple generations newer traction control and electronic controls than the Aprilia does. And if the ergos between this bike and the RS4 are very similar, their power bands couldn't be much different. Whereas the RS4 has a really strong mid-range, and because of that, the top end pull does not feel all that exciting compared to a bike where the power kind of all comes at once. This thing feels pretty flat in the mid-range, but when it comes into the power band, it is just taking off. It literally feels like the power band of a 600, but it's just bumped up by 40 or 50 horsepower. While that might not be the best for cruising along in a low gear, I'm sure on the track when you're keeping it on boil, it's just a monster. On the other hand, the upside of that power band is that it feels really exciting. When you rip on the throttle and the tacho sweeps into that sweet spot in the power band, the bike just leaps forward. The front wheel claws the air and just you have to hold on for dear life. I rode the bike earlier today in A mode, which has the more abrupt throttle response and kind of less nanny controls, I believe. And I just could not get the hang of the throttle. Like, I feel like I have really good throttle control. I've prided myself in that. I ride the Aprilia in track mode, which is the most abrupt throttle mode that it has, and I have a Motion Pro quick throttle on that bike. And I feel like I can be pretty responsive and smooth with that throttle. And I just could not get the hang of this thing in A mode. Of course, given more time, you know, I've only been on the bike for 40 miles or so today. Thankfully, all these electronic aids are all very user programmable. So I now have myself set up a mode with the wheelie control turned off, the traction control and the slide control still on, but with power mode 2, which gives a slightly less abrupt throttle response, which I'm finding works a lot better for me at least. Not knowing all that much about the different modes on this bike, unfortunately, I don't know if that means I'm giving up power, but it still feels ridiculously fast, so I'm not too worried about it. Especially on the street, you honestly can't use the majority of the power from a crazy bike like this. It's intuitive to go fast on, though. Once you kind of get your head around the throttle, you gain mid-corner stability for what you give up on that initial flick-in speed. So I think that's a pretty fair compromise, and honestly nothing that you couldn't change with suspension setup or geometry. Bikes these days, especially a bike like this, are so adjustable. The way they come out of the box is really just how the manufacturer thinks will be best for the majority of riders, but that might not necessarily be what you like in a bike's handling, so you can easily fix that. The two stats I will throw out are the wet weight on these is supposedly a realistic 440 something pounds. And they're putting down, I've seen dyno charts in the mid 170s at the rear wheel. Like everything in the US, we get a slightly neutered version. So I've seen that you can use an aftermarket ECU flash to get yourself another 10 horsepower. This particular bike is all stock, but I would say if you're thinking about one of these, maybe budget in the money that you're using to buy the bike to just go ahead and do the flash right away. I think that's between $200 and $400. So in the grand scheme of things, it's not a ton of money. Certainly less money than the exhaust that you're going to put on it is going to cost. And speaking of the exhaust, it's a bit quiet, but it's stock, so what can you expect? I do like that Yamaha, with the valve system they're using in the exhaust, and they have been for a long time. I think they're actually the pioneers of that system with the exit valve and such. That when you're around town, it's absolutely quiet. But when you're on it in a straight line and you get that thing up in the revs and the throttle open, the exhaust gets a lot louder and it sounds great. And Yamaha's cross-plane inline 4 sounds amazing. It sounds like no other inline 4. It sounds much closer to the V4 in the Aprilia than it does to any other inline motor. Whoa, there we go, slipper clutch. I like that. I like that it still lets you have a little fun with the back end on downshifts. These days, bikes seem to have so little engine braking, and with the slipper clutches, you never get to get the bike a little sideways on the brakes, which kind of takes away some of the fun to me. So I like that you can still have some fun there. Whew, man, it does pull. We're obviously on a public road, and you know, this is not my bike, so I'm not going to be going too crazy. But I feel like I've gotten comfortable on the bike really fast. Maybe not as fast as that Daytona that I was riding a couple weeks ago. But it's an intuitive bike to ride. I can see why these things have gained popularity. Not that the R1 has ever been unpopular, but man, this thing is amazing. And the way that motor pulls. We've had the Aprilia and this bike side by side a couple times today, and granted, this thing is bone stock, and the Aprilia has a full system and an ECU flash and shorter gearing, but they're almost dead evenly matched. I don't think that this has anything for the Aprilia on the top end, So I would say in that regard, the Aprilia has the advantage because it has the same top end pole, more or less, but with way better mid-range. But again, with the caveat that this is bone stock, so with a map flash and a gearing change and whatever else you want to do in exhaust, I've seen dyno charts from Attack where they got 190 something horsepower out of this bike to the rear wheel. So there's no RSV4 that's going to touch that. Granted, the 2016 RSV4 now has 15 more horsepower and is supposedly over 200. So maybe this and that are evenly matched after all, but whew, oh man. So that felt way too short. In conclusion, what a cracking bike. This thing is great. Go buy one of these right now. Whew. Oh. Brap.